Hello, APUSH students, and welcome to Period 3, Chapter 5, the American Revolution and Confederation. So we're now getting into the American Revolution. We talked about everything leading up to the American Revolution in Chapter 4, French and Indian War, taxes that are put on colonists, the rebellion kind of starting. But it's important to understand that at this point in time, we still do not have a huge number of people that are wanting to break away from Great Britain at this point in time. Are there some? Yes, absolutely, but that is not the overarching theme. It is more that we just want to fix our relationship with Great Britain instead of completely fracturing it. We're getting to the point, though, where we are more people are on board for freedom and independence, but we're not there yet. So the First Continental Congress met in 1774. Representatives from every colony except for Georgia sent delegates in order to Philadelphia. Their goal is to respond to the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts and the Quebec Act. They at the conference they rejected the Intolerable Acts. They said they should be repealed. They urged the colonies to prepare for possible war and started organizing boycotts. And so that's what was decided at the First Continental Congress in 1774. So we had 12 colonies of the 13, one vote per colony that were represented. There were two plans, really. There was a Pennsylvania plan, which is that they are really trying to stay faithful to the British. Here's kind of what it said from Galloway. Resolved that this Congress will apply to His Majesty for a redress of grievances under which his faithful subjects in American labor, and assure him that the colonies hold in abhorrence the idea of being considered independent communities on the British government, and most ardently desired the establishment of a political union not only among themselves but with the mother state upon close principles of safety and freedom, which are essential in the constitution of all free governments, and particularly that of British legislature. They needed 7 votes to pass. They only got 5. And so what was actually passed was the Suffolk Resolve or the Massachusetts Plan. And this was a little bit harsher language. They proclaimed the Coercive Acts to be unconstitutional and void, and that the officials charged with the enforcement of those illegal acts were called upon to resign. They urged Massachusetts to establish a free state until the Coercive Acts were repealed, and they suggested that all future tax collections be retained by the new Massachusetts government and not passed along to British officials. So it's a little bit harsher language. Going along with that, they also passed the Articles of Association, which basically is the colonies boycotting British goods. So December 1st, 1774, as long as Parliament did not respond, they were going to have a complete ban on British importation of tea. And so if they didn't respond, they were going to then stop exports, all exports to Britain, hoping that that will cause some form of change going forward. We also get introduced to Patrick Henry, who is the famous Virginia man who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And he was at the Second Virginia Convention basically to do 2 things. 1, to discuss a strategy against the British, and 2, to select delegates for the Second Continental Congress. At the First Continental Congress, they set up a time to meet again. This was going to be in 1775. So they set up a time to meet again. And so after hearing a bunch of people speak, he got up and spoke, and his final statement was, "Give me liberty or give me death." So if we look at kind of the imports and exports, you can see how it's being affected in 1774, how it's going down. Imports from Britain go way down during 1774. Exports go way down at the beginning of 1775. So December 1774 and into January 1775, you can see they go way down. That is the Article of Association. You can see the Loyalist strongholds here. Main Loyalist strongholds were around cities, port cities, cities that really relied on trade with Great Britain. And so that's going to be your port cities. New York was a huge loyalist stronghold. And if you remember, our boy Alexander Hamilton's from New York. And so while that was another kind of hotbed for the revolution, it was not the over, I don't know, the majority of people there did not kind of have that same view. We also see this sign, this flag. This is the Gadsden flag. And if we compare it to the past Albany Plan of Union flag from Benjamin Franklin, we can see the snake again. We can see here it was join or die. That was before the or during the after the French and Indian War, but before any of the conventions. That the colonists need to join for their own protection, join for their own good. And now you can see, don't tread on me. It's a rattlesnake that is coiled up and ready to strike at any moment. Basically saying, we are ready to strike, so stop messing around with us. Give us what we want. And what we want is representation in Congress. I personally like this flag better. I think it's less scary. So instead of don't tread on me, I like no step on snake. So then we get to the famous ride of Paul Revere. And if you have ever heard Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem about Paul Revere, that's why that's one of the things that really made him famous. When they had the community correspondence and they said, we're going to tell you what's going on, they have writers. And Paul Revere and William Dawes, which I doubt you've ever heard of William Dawes, they were the ones that were in charge of warning the colonists and warning the Minutemen of any approaching British soldiers. So on April 18th, 1775, British troops were crossing the Charles River and they were marching on their way to Lexington. Their goal was actually to arrest John Hancock and Sam Adams. And so Dawes was the guy that was actually in charge of warning them. And Paul Revere went around the town warning that the British were coming and that the Minutemen need to get ready. And then on April 19th, the next day, shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. April 19th, 1775, the Revolutionary War begins. We are not in the Declaration of Independence yet. This is a year plus before the Declaration of Independence. So I think people combine the Declaration movement with the Revolutionary War, and they're not the same thing. The Revolutionary War was completely separate. They just wanted representation, and the British were upset that they were boycotting tea. The British were upset that they were kind of revolting and not following the directions that they're supposed to do. And so Lexington and Concord is that first battle of the American Revolution. King George had declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion and sent troops. The British troops were trying to seize colonial military supplies at Concord. And although they were alerted and the Minutemen assembled, they were forced to retreat, and the British were able to destroy some of the supplies. And so you could say that it was a mini victory for the British, but on the way back to Boston, the British were actually ambushed and suffered very heavy losses. And that's what the goal was for Lexington and Concord. So it was an early victory for British, but then the Patriots kind of got some revenge by attacking those 4,000 the British soldiers with 4,000 Patriots. Bunker Hill is another one, and this is where Americans were trying to the siege of Boston, which take place for over about 11 months. The Battle of Bunker Hill, and actually it's the Battle of Breed's Hill, because most of the fighting actually took place on Breed's Hill, but that might not, I don't know if that doesn't have a good ring to it or what. But in June of 1775, Bunker Hill happens, and a lot of the fighting is going to be harsh. They're trying to hold a hill. So 1,600 Patriots. Redcoats tried 3 times to take the hill, eventually took it on the last try. So you could say that it was successful. However, they won the battle, but at a huge cost, which was 1,100 of the 2,400 were either killed, wounded, or missing. So they were defeated, but the Americans, of course, we basically say it's a moral victory because we basically held the superior British forces to I don't know, you could almost call it a stalemate. Second Continental Congress happens in the spring of 1775, and at this we're still not ready for independence yet. The Second Continental Congress, what happened at that was that they called for the formation of a Continental Army that was to be led by George Washington. It was actually John Adams who wanted George Washington to lead, and so he does. What the reason why they really wanted to keep George Washington as a general is because they wanted Southern support. They needed Southern support, and the Southerners were concerned with the growing equality movement and growing movement against slavery, and so they were worried that if the colonists win, they're going to abolish slavery, and they needed their slaves, of course. So what they did is they passed the Olive Branch Petition. And the Olive Branch Petition is basically an attempt by Congress to avoid war, full-blown war with Britain. Remember, this happens in April, and we're just at the beginning. We don't want war. Sure, a few skirmishes are fine, but we don't want full war. They sent a petition, and when you look at Olive Branch, giving somebody an olive branch is a sign of peace. And so they sent this petition to the king to allow the colonies to remain part of the British Empire, but they wanted more independence. They kind of wanted that salutary neglect like they had before and more freedom within their empire. And basically the king responded saying, no, not at all. He declared all of the colonies now in rebellion and cut all trade with the colonists. Even though at this point in time, we still are not a majority that were looking for independence. In 1775, there was not a majority who were looking for independence, just the radical groups. The Olive Branch Petition was originally written by Thomas Jefferson, but they changed it because they thought Thomas Jefferson was a little bit too offensive. And so John Dickinson, who was our letter from a Pennsylvania farmer, he wrote it. It didn't really matter because the king saw it as offensive anyway. And so he angrily refused. We said Washington's name is Commander. The name of his horse is Nelson. He was nominated by John Adams at the Second Continental Congress. Then we get into Thomas Paine, and I shared with you guys excerpts from Common Sense. Common Sense was a pamphlet by Thomas Paine who urged Americans to declare independence with Great Britain. He argued that it was wrong for a large continent to be ruled by a corrupt government 2,000 miles away. And it's really going to set the stage for the Declaration of Independence later on. But what he did is he challenged British authority. He tried to speak to the common people in common language. And then he, not for the first time, but for the first time in a popular pamphlet, he asked for independence. Over 500,000 copies were sold in just the first few months. And it's really going to pave the way for the Declaration of Independence. So it was published in January 1776. So 6 months, right? 6 months before the Declaration is passed. Gave outline for new government based on a republic, which is going to be the foundation. And here is some quotes, or a quote from Thomas Paine. You can pause it if you want. I'm going to go on. Couple of videos if you'd like to watch those. Those are shared. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, huge influence on the Declaration of Independence. George Mason, James Madison, who was a secondary author, he's going to be secondary author of the Bill of Rights as well, but he is going to be the guy that helps write our Constitution, actually, which we are about to talk about. So Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, essentially is a big old breakup letter. And if you were in class, you remember me talking about basically it is our way of breaking up with Great Britain. Written by Thomas Jefferson, 1776, it establishes independence from England. So the Revolutionary War, if we look at revolutions across the world, most revolutions are there for change. We look at the French Revolution, look at a lot of the revolutions in Latin America and even in Russia, and I think they're just asking for a change. They're not looking for independence. They're not looking to be a different country. They're just asking for change or wanting change. Ours is now different. We now have a purpose for fighting. We create a new nation, and now we have a purpose for fighting, not just to get change, but to be free. Declaration of Independence reflected a lot of Locke's ideas of government's obligation to protect natural rights of life, liberty, and property. So John Locke, he basically said that you need to abolish unjust governments in order to, or it is your duty, I should say, to abolish unjust governments if they are not protecting those. And so that is kind of the basis for the Declaration of Independence. They did talk about emancipation of slavery, but knew that they couldn't do it. You can see the Declaration. So why are they important? Two. One thing that they were really used to as propaganda during the war to get people on board, with the war and get people on board with the independence movement, I guess. And it's used to kind of sway opinion in favor of independence. However, we still need to fight the war. We're not done fighting the war. We still need to fight the war. It also brings up this point of republicanism. Republicanism is that the belief that all colonists are virtuous and we have the civic virtue, and that in order for us to succeed, individuals have to sacrifice their own needs for the benefit of the community. Although a lot of leaders doubt this, the common person actually believes that they are doing this for a cause and doing this for a reason. And this virtue really is the basis for our first government, that people have virtue and will do what's best and do what's right. And that's the Articles of Confederation. But if you look at who would win, the British are the most highly trained army and navy, greatest navy in the world at this point. Whereas the Americans are a lot of state militia. Yes, we do have a professional army, but it's small, never having more than 20,000 people in it. Most of what we have is just militia groups. So the Patriots are mainly from New England, Virginia. That's kind of the largest group of people that are going to fight. If you remember looking at the Loyalist strongholds and where they're coming from, it's not coming from cities, they're coming from farms. So we do have a lot of farmers, always short of supply, always short of equipment, not paid or not paid on time, even though they're supposed to be. The professional army is supposed to be paid on time. The state militias were actually paid by the local governments. And so it is they're a little bit more better paid or paid on time, but still very rarely paid. African Americans were originally not allowed to fight until the British promised them freedom, so they were worried that they would go over to the British side. So did Washington. Washington basically said that emancipation is going to be something we discuss and we look at. Your loyalists or your Tories. If we look at 20-30% of our country at this point in time was still loyalists. They still believed in the British cause. And so 60,000 Tories fought alongside the British. And after the war, they were feared that they were going to be tried for treason. So a lot of them emigrated to Canada or Britain because they knew they were going to face persecution. Of course, the Indians are going to support the British, even though in the past, when it was British versus French, they didn't like the British. But in reality, they just didn't like the colonists because of the encroachment that was going on and all that. We already kind of talked about the siege of Boston, this 11-month siege. Eventually, they were forced to retreat to New York, where they took over, also New York being a loyalist strong point. The British expectations are kind of based off of what happened in the French and Indian War and the fact that our soldiers are not good. They didn't think that our soldiers were good in any way and were qualified in any way. And so they were very overconfident, and they had zero expectations for our soldiers. And one of the reasons that they will end up losing is because they're fighting a war 2,000 miles away. American expectations, man, we thought we were good, but we knew that winning and losing battles isn't important. You should just, last and stick it out. Washington realized we just need to hang on and survive. It's kind of like a survival of the fittest. He's going to only engage the British when he needs to or when he knows he has an advantage, and try to drag the war out as long as it was possible to get the British people and citizenry against the war. So he's counting on England eventually growing tired and agreeing to peace. Not necessarily the soldiers and the government, but the people having a huge backlash. Attack, retreat, avoid defeat. Those are his goals. The British strategy is to end the war quickly. Like try to get it over as quick as possible. I'm pretty sure that's an actual picture. I don't have proof, but I think that's an actual picture. So, Battle of New York, Washington is essentially crushed by the British in December of 1776. A third of New York was burned in preparation of the battle by the American people. Then we get to the Battle of Trenton, which is, things are not going very well. And in Christmas night of 1776, Washington made his famous trek across the Delaware River, where you get the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware River. Completely surprises the British forces at Trenton, and then all 1,400 soldiers surrendered to Washington, and only 5 Americans were lost. It wasn't just military victory that was important. It really kept the revolution going. It gave them hope moving forward. And here's the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. The 2 battles that you really need to know about are Battle of Saratoga is one. And you don't really know much about the battle, just that the British were chasing Americans in New York. Americans were gathering more troops all the time. They fought the British in and around Saratoga. They surrounded the enemy at Saratoga. They surrounded the troops and forced them to surrender. This is not the important part that they won. The important part of this is that because they won, the French decided to become our ally. They decided to move from quiet aid to actually openly declaring war and being on our side. And so this is going to completely change the outlook of the war. If you've ever watched Hamilton, Guns and Ships is kind of about that. So you can read that if you like. Yorktown, the final battle of the war. So between 78 and 81, it's mainly fought in the South. Battle of Cowpens, battles that were fought in farms and farmland and just in rural areas. But Yorktown is going to be the end. Lord Cornwallis arrives in Yorktown and tries to set up a fort and await supplies. However, the French forces have surrounded the fort, and the French Navy has blockaded. Patriot forces outnumber them 2-1. And they bombard British with artillery fire from the naval fleet, plus they blockade for supplies. And so on October 19th, 1781, 6 years and 6 months from the day of the first battle, the British formally surrender on October 19th. True. So what is going to finish the battle is the Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris happened in 1783. I guess one of the questions is, what do we do with France? But what happens is British recognizes us as an independent nation. The Mississippi River is recognized as the western boundary of the United States. We get some fishing rights off Canada. And then we are going to pay debts owed to British merchants, even though we never do, and honor the loyalist claims that we have. So you can see America. This is the new America. This is disputed territory, which is not a huge deal right now. But here's the America that we have. Here are the colonies. As you can see, these are all land ceded by the natives, whether it was on purpose or whether it was just given, bought. And what we have is the Articles of Confederation is going to be our first government. It is a loose league of friendship, created in 1777, November 1777, after we declared war. Not right, a year and a half after, but right after we declared war. And it's established as on purpose, a very weak central government. You can kind of see if you want to pause these. You don't need to write any of these down, just pause them. So 2 things that are good about the Articles of Confederation. One, the Land Ordinance of 1785. That is going to create a policy of surveying and selling. It's going to create a policy of surveying and selling Western lands. Like how do we take Western lands? The second thing is Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And 2 things that does. One, it sets rules for creating new states. And it says that all new states have the rights and powers of the original colonies, as well as banning slavery north of the Ohio River, which is something kind of unheard of at the time. And here is some of the places of dispute and place of influence. And that's all. So that is chapter 5 of our time period 3. Thanks for listening.